Hello everybody, I'm Ian Austin and I want to welcome you all to Dudley's annual Holocaust commemoration. I want to thank everybody who's joined us. We've got more than 200 people online, which I think is absolutely fantastic. I want to thank everybody at Dudley College and the Students' Union, all the volunteers and the Holocaust Educational Trust, everyone who's helped ensure this event can continue online this year. We're joined today by the Mayor of Dudley, David Stanley, Councillor David Stanley, all of the borough's MPs, Mark O'Longy, Pat McFadden, James Morris, Susan Webb and Mike Wood, and by Steve McCabe, the MP for Birmingham Selly Oak. Councillor Patrick Harley, the leader of the council, is with us, Kevin O'Keefe, the council's chief executive, and lots of other councillors and officers from the council. And we're really grateful to all of you for coming. In particular, I think it's absolutely brilliant that we've got so many teachers and pupils from local schools who are with us learning where hatred and prejudice can lead, and that's really the whole point of this event. After me, we'll be hearing from Helen Lawley, the President of the Students' Union, James Hibbard, a photography student here at Dudley College who visited Auschwitz with the Holocaust Educational Trust, the Bishop of Dudley, Martin Gorick, and the Lord Lieutenant John Crabtree, CBE. But most of all, I want to thank Manfred Goldberg, BEM, for joining us today to tell us about his direct personal experience of the Holocaust. You all might have seen Manfred on the TV news this week because he was on the news speaking to Her Royal Highness, the Duchess of Cambridge, about the Holocaust. And Manfred, I just want to say to you that it's humbling to all of us that you're prepared to use your experience of these terrible events and give so much of your time to teach communities like ours about history's greatest crime. We're so grateful to you for joining us today and for everything that you do all year.
Thank you.
Now, the Holocaust was the systematic genocide of the Jewish people. And we're here today, I think, for three reasons. We meet every year so that our community can honour the memory of the 6 million Jewish men, women and children and all the others killed by the Nazis and their collaborators. We learn from listening to survivors like Manfred that whilst the Holocaust ended in the industrial murder of millions of people in gas chambers, it started with prejudice and hatred, lies and conspiracy theories, communities being divided, and people being singled out or bullied because of their race or religion. The message of Holocaust Memorial Week this year calls on all of us to be the light in the darkness. And I think that's asking all of us to stand up and challenge racism and prejudice wherever we find it, whether that's at school, in our community, amongst our friends at work, for those of us in politics, in our parties, wherever we find it. And finally, whilst nothing compares to the unique horror of the Holocaust, we learn from more recent genocides, or for example, the brutal treatment of the Uyghur community in China, that the human race has still not fully learned all the lessons. So we're here today to build a stronger community, a more united country, and a fairer world, and to dedicate ourselves to oppose the ugly poison of racial or religious prejudice and hatred wherever it occurs. And now I'd like to invite Helen Lawley, the President of the Students' Union, to read a poem.
Just having some technical difficulties, bear with us 1 second.
Thank you, Ian. Poem's called Light of Hope from Rachel Sim. Endless dark, or so it seems, life is shattered with all our dreams. Of joy and hope, the fading light, of darkness, darkness for all in sight. No words can speak of pain that's born, or fears unfounded, the sharpest thorn. Deserted mind with heart and soul, the wish of death the bell will toll. A mind of riddles and flesh with scorn, a hope for day, a light of dawn. The night is long and the darkness has set, the hope of morn existing yet. But morn will be and dark will fade, light of hope, the desert shade, a winter's comfort and summer's breeze, as blooms of spring, the sun appears. A welcome friend, the silence broke. My soul returns, my demons choke. In shadows of heart and soul and mind, reasons walked by darkness can't mind. All right in friendship, glorious light. Survival comes from God's own power. Endurance through my darkest hour. Now I'd like to introduce James Hibbard, a student and an ambassador for the Holocaust Educational Trust.
Thank you, Helen. Holocaust Memorial Day is an international day of remembrance commemorating the 6 million Jewish men, women and children who were murdered during the Holocaust. The occasion plays a vital part in addressing the horrors of the past, but most importantly it brings people together to listen and learn from those who survived. In 2021 we are among the last generation that will have the privilege to hear the first-hand testimony of Holocaust survivors, making events like this one more important and poignant than ever before. The importance of Holocaust remembrance was reaffirmed for me early last year when I took part in the Holocaust Educational Trust's Lessons from Auschwitz project. Since starting the project Trust, I've been fortunate enough to hear from 4 incredible survivors, including Mindu Hornick, MBE, Joan Salter, MBE, Marla Tribich, MBE, and most memorably for me, Hannah Lewis, MBE, whose heartbreaking recollection of how as a young girl she watched SS gunmen execute her mother will stay with me forever. I could see how difficult it was for each of these survivors to revisit their past, so it is truly inspiring to me that they are able to do events like this one. When we listen to a survivor share their testimony, we too become a witness to the events of the Holocaust. We are being entrusted with these stories to pass on to future generations so that they are never forgotten. As part of the project, we visited the notorious death and concentration camp Auschwitz-Birkenau in Poland. This trip completely changed my life. No longer was the Holocaust something I read about online or saw on TV. It was real. I was stood on the same ground where approximately 1 million Jews were murdered by the Nazis during the Second World War. I was shocked by the sheer scale of the site. This single camp had such a massive impact on me. To try and fully visualise the extent of the damage it caused was unfathomable, but I know by visiting it I took one step closer to understanding the impact it had on the world. It wasn't until I entered the room of hair that I first really began to comprehend where I was. I had never seen anything like this before. I still remember how I stood rooted to the spot, staring for several long seconds at the enormous display of hair before me. This room showing how brutal the Nazi regime had been. In another room was the Book of Names, a 16,000-page book which contained the 4.2 million names of those who were known to be murdered in the Holocaust. The book made me realise the importance of remembering every single person who made up that figure. It made me see beyond the numbers, instead seeing people, the same as you and me, whose lives were so callously taken away. As a photographer, I took part in the visit with the intention of documenting what I saw. I remember thinking a lot about how I was going to go about doing this, but it was not until I was in the security line talking to Rabbi Epstein that I began to understand the importance of what I was doing. He said to me that there was no right or wrong way for me to present the Holocaust, and that me being there at the camp in 2020 with my camera was significant enough. The Nazis went to great lengths to try and alleviate any knowledge of the Holocaust. Files were destroyed, gas chambers were blown up, and evidence was removed. We were not meant to know about Auschwitz-Birkenau, but the Nazis failed. 75 years on, I was there bearing witness to the atrocities they committed and documenting it through photography. By visiting the places that we were never meant to know existed, and by listening to the testimonies of incredibly brave survivors such as Hannah Lewis, we are ensuring the Holocaust is never forgotten and that hatred and discrimination will not be allowed to permeate in our society today. Following the visit, I wanted to communicate the invaluable lessons that I had learned, so for my Next Steps project, I chose to put together a book of photos. This book allowed me to share with my friends and family what I had seen on the visit, the scale of the site, the Book of Names, and the memorial to those who were murdered. Through this book, I wanted to demonstrate the importance of Holocaust remembrance and inspire them to share what they had learned with others. Although the events of the Holocaust took place almost 80 years ago, its impact is still felt today. Around the globe, anti-Semitism and other forms of hate and discrimination still exist, and even more scarily, in some places, they are being allowed to thrive. It is the aim of the Holocaust Educational Trust to make sure that hate is not allowed to go unchecked and is always being challenged. In my role as an ambassador, it is my responsibility to share what I have learned and to encourage others to remember the Holocaust, my friends, my family, and our community. Attending this event is a first great step for many of us in doing our own part in standing up against hate and discrimination. I would like to say a massive thank you to the Holocaust Educational Trust for providing me with this life-changing opportunity, and to everyone here today. By attending this event, you are making a difference. And I'd also like to say another massive thank you to the incredibly brave and inspiring survivors who find the courage to share with us their personal experiences to try and make the world a better place. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of us all, I'd like to thank Manfred Goldberg, BEM, for joining us today. Manfred was born in Germany in 1930, and we are so grateful that he is joining us today to talk about his and his family's experiences in the Holocaust. He was awarded the BEM in the Queen's New Year's Honours List in 2018 in recognition of his work in Holocaust education, and it is a huge privilege for me to introduce him to speak to us today. Thank you, Manfred.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. In my talk today, I will attempt to give you a small insight into what the term Holocaust actually meant to us Jews who experienced it. But before I begin to give you my personal testimony, I feel I ought to spend a couple of minutes to explain to the younger generation the temperament of the reaction of the world to what was developing, how the Holocaust actually came into being. I will have to cut it short because we are tight for time. Well, when the Nazis gained power in 1933, they did not waste any time in passing a stream of anti-Jewish legislation. It was done publicly, and it accelerated and grew over the years. The world was self-evidently aware that Jews were being persecuted and their lives were at risk in Germany. Jewish people were desperate to leave, but in practice, many countries have kept their borders tightly shut, and a few merciful ones, of which I'm happy and proud to say the UK was certainly among those. They were more merciful, and there was a possibility, although it was still difficult. The Americans were beginning to be criticized for the difficulties they put in the way of Jewish emigration, and President Roosevelt called a conference in July 1938. It was known as the Evian Conference. It was 32 nations gathered to work out a way of helping Jews find shelter. Well, the Nazis officially had said they would permit Jews to leave Germany, but when these representatives at the conference realized that that meant before Jews were allowed to leave Germany, they would be stripped of all their possessions, sympathy towards these Jews rapidly evaporated, and the conference turned into a complete failure. And I feel that Hitler took this public demonstration of blatant indifference to the suffering of the Jewish people in Germany as the green light to begin working on his, what should I say, extermination machine. A few months later, Kristallnacht on the 9th of November was a national orgy engineered and organized by the Nazis. There were many military men involved in this. When a nationwide assault was made on Jewish property, some Jews were beaten up, some were killed, and around 30,000 Jewish men were sent to concentration camps, which had already been opened in 1939. Many Jews were so desperate to leave Germany that they actually paid substantial sums to professional smugglers to guide them across the borders into adjoining countries like France, Belgium, or Holland. Of course, these countries were later occupied by the Nazis, and the majority of these Jews who thought they were safe were in fact rounded up and sent to the death camps. But that was the climate in Germany. Jews would have left gladly, but there was no one who accepted us. I'm explaining this primarily to the high proportion of young people who are listening today. You have grown up in a different climate, and you will probably have difficulty in understanding how different the climate was back in the 1930s. Well, I will now begin my testimony. Both my parents were born in Poland, but they came to Germany as singles. They married in Germany, settled in a town called Kassel, where I was born in 1930 and my brother in 1934. My parents had lived in Germany for more than 20 years when in mid-1939 my father was arrested and he was told he was being deported to Poland. Well, the Poles refused to accept him and the Nazis detained him. My mother courageously approached the office dealing with these matters and begged for my father's release, but was told that the only alternative to being sent to a concentration camp was immediate emigration. But of course, as I told you, visas were more precious than gold. You just could not obtain a visa. Nevertheless, my mother made several unsuccessful attempts, and eventually she went to the British consulate in Berlin, and she met there what she always from that day on called an angel. The British passport officer heard her desperate, heartbreaking story, granted her a single visa for my father to leave Germany because he was in immediate danger, and told her he was under such pressure that it would take about 8 weeks for the rest of the family to obtain visas to follow my father. The Nazis, on presentation of the visa, kept their promise, but insisted that my father leave Germany within 24 hours. He left Germany on the 20th of August 1939, and 2 weeks later the war broke out, and as a result my mother with 2 young children we were all trapped in Germany. My father eventually for 6 years had no idea of the fate of his family, because there was no contact between us, of course. Life for Jews was already pretty difficult, and that's putting it mildly. It was a nightmare. Jews were forbidden to engage in any commerce or business, and any firm, any non-Jewish firm, Jewish firms were already confiscated by the Nazis, but many Jewish people worked in the civil service or for non-Jewish firms. By law, they all had to be dismissed. And of course, there was financial hardship. No Jew could any longer earn a living. We weren't allowed to enter any non-Jewish shops. There was just one shop in our town where Jews had to do their shopping. We weren't allowed to enter any public park. We weren't allowed to own a radio. We weren't allowed to go to the cinema. We lost our nationality and therefore all our civic rights. Doctors, lawyers were not allowed to practice. It was really a noose that was being tightened all the time. We survived for 2 years in this climate, and late in 1941 there was a knock on our door. 2 uniformed men told my mother that she had 10 minutes to pack a suitcase, and then we had to accompany them. They advised her to pack some food and water. They walked us to the railway station, where a crowd of Jews was gathered already, each one accompanied by a suitcase. This grew eventually to 1,000 Jewish people. We were packed into a train, taken to an unknown destination. We had no idea where they were taking us. We traveled for 3 days and 3 nights. If I may please have the first slide, it will show you where we were being taken. The next one, please. It shows you a map which shows the distance between lower left Kassel, which was our hometown, and top right, the arrow points to Riga. Riga is the capital city of Latvia. It was a distance of 1,000 miles we had been taken. As we left the train, we were ordered to. On the ground there was heavy snow and ice. We were surrounded by armed guards now, who formed us into a long column and marched us into Riga town. We were taken to a part of the old town which had been surrounded by a very substantial barbed wire fence all around the perimeter of what turned out to be the Riga ghetto. We were housed in that ghetto. They opened about 40 or 50 houses to accommodate thousands of us. It was grossly overcrowded. More than one family had to share each room. It took almost no time for us to find out what had happened here. I will tell you a little later just how we found out. This ghetto in which we were housed had been occupied by 28,000 Riga Jews. The Nazis occupied Latvia and Riga, of course, in mid-1941, and within almost a matter of days they had put up this barbed wire and established the Riga ghetto. They then ordered all 28,000 Jews living in Riga to move from their homes into the Riga ghetto. They had been in this camp from about late August until about mid-November. The Nazis put into operation a devilish plan. They lied to these Jews and told them that they were being taken to another camp, and in groups they marched them instead into a nearby forest, where by using slave labor they had dug 3 enormous pits, and as each group of Jews approached, machine guns opened fire, and these Jews either fell into these pits or were thrown into the pits. Quite a proportion, presumably, were not actually killed outright, but just wounded, and they were buried alive. The Germans were not even very generous with the bullets, and so many Jews probably were buried alive. And days later, the first transports of German Jews arrived and were housed in the same accommodation that had been occupied by these Riga Jews. When they entered the ghetto, they were allowed to take some personal possessions. When they were taken to be murdered, all these possessions had to be left behind, and we found all these possessions. We were told this atrocity firsthand by 30 young men who were allowed to survive, and their qualification for survival was that they all were fluent German speakers. They were appointed internal police in our ghetto, and they told us of this firsthand. The ghetto gradually filled up with more transports after we had arrived, until eventually it was again packed with around 30,000. But as far as we were concerned, the day we arrived they put us on a starvation diet. The following morning there was a major assembly. An SS officer told us that we had to hand over to them all money and valuables, jewelry we possessed, on pain of death. They also told us that we no longer had any names. They allocated a number to each one of us, and we had to remember that, because forgetting our number often resulted in physical punishment, which was lashes with a whip. Not always, but frequently. I can tell you my number to this day, 46578. it's engraved in my memory because for the next 3.5 years I often had to recite it. Never my name, always my number identified me. He also said that everyone over the age of 13 had to assemble each morning and they would be marched out to work in factories nearby. Many of these factories didn't sort of emerge close to these camps. They were built by German industrialists who had been persuaded by the Nazis to establish these factories on the promise of having unlimited supplies of slave labor. And in these factories we had to work producing goods to help the German war effort. I was aged 11 and my little brother 7. We did not have to work, and I was now in charge of my little brother. We had been in this camp for only about 3 months. In March 42, we witnessed our first mass selection, which meant no one went to work that day. We were in groups, marched into a nearby hall, where single file we had to shuffle forward until each one of us stood in front of an SS officer who glanced at each person in turn and pointed left or right. We were so innocent that it didn't occur to us that it meant death. Today, if you were pointed left, and survival if you were pointed right. In fact, we were so innocent that although it had become apparent that all elderly people were pointed to the left and younger and healthier looking people to the right, often when elderly people have been turned to the left, their children pleaded with the SS man to make an exception and allow them to join their parents, and occasionally he actually agreed. The truth became apparent when a couple of days later truckloads of clothing was delivered to the Riga ghetto, and some inmates were ordered to sort this clothing. The Nazis told them that after sorting it would be sent to Germany to be distributed to needy Germans. And in sorting the clothing, some of the sorters actually recognized items of clothing which had been worn by their loved ones on the day they were taken away. The Nazis had lied to us and told us that they were also being sent to another camp where the work would be less demanding for these weaker people. In fact, of course, they had been forced to strip and they were murdered in the same manner as these Latvian Jews. That was the conclusion we came to, and I've had it substantiated in print. You will see it on Wikipedia. I have not told you how my mother obtained a single visa in detail. Time pressure prevents me from doing so, but if you're interested, go online with the name Frank Foley and you'd be rewarded with a heartwarming story. He was the passport officer who saved my father's life. So, in this manner, we spent more than a year in the Riga ghetto until in August 1943, during that morning assembly, which was a daily occurrence. That's when people were arranged in groups to be marched to work. If I may please, this is the picture you're looking at now. The map was just a primitive map of the Riga ghetto. Here you're looking at one of these work groups being marched off for daily forced labor. In addition to this mass selection I described to you, there were also daily dangers. Our guards were ordered to keep an eye on people working in these factories, and if they found anyone who, as a result of the ongoing starvation diet, which incidentally started the day we arrived and was continuous mercilessly until the day of our liberation. If they weakened as a result of the diet or the lack of hygiene or not having any treatment when they felt unwell and could no longer perform to the German satisfaction, that person was taken aside and either had to walk, or if he resisted, he was dragged. Here you see a photograph which must have been taken by one of the guards to what was called an execution site, where he was shot and their body was just thrown into a mass grave. People just went to work in the morning and didn't return, and that was their fate. This man you see being dragged was probably dead an hour later. Well, on that morning in August, we were organized, I think around 2,000 of us were asked to step aside, and we were packed into cattle trucks, sealed wagons, with no food, no water, and we set off on a 2-day journey to a labor camp, which was called Prechu. Prechu was purpose-built. It was just large barracks surrounded by a barbed wire fence, and in these barracks were 3-tier high bunk beds, and one of these bunk beds became home to each one of us. Again, work groups were sent out, but my mother and I were put to different work. Both of us were allocated to a group of 300 who were marched out daily to a nearby very busy railway junction. The Allies had by then become aware that they could damage the war effort of the Germans severely by bombing the railway lines. The Germans had long supply lines to their war front in the east, where they were fighting Russia, and all supplies were sent to these soldiers by rail. So the Allies began bombing busy junctions to stop this traffic. Well, this was one such junction which was regularly bombed by the Allies, and they put our group to work to dig up the bomb-damaged rails, level the ground, and then we had to relay new lines to make the line serviceable again. We were in this camp for 1 year, and throughout this year we were taken from one bomb-damaged site to another. As we repaired, the Allies returned and bombed somewhere nearby, and we were taken there to repair the next damaged section, and so on. We had been in this camp for only a matter of weeks. I have to tell you, in this camp, everyone had to work. I was then aged 13, and I was, as I told you, part of that slave labor group working on the rails. My little brother was one of 4 children. He was aged 9. You see it on its photograph, he's on the right and I'm on the left. This was taken probably when he was 5 or 6. It's one of the few photographs we have. Of course, we lost all our family possessions through the war. But when we returned from work, some weeks after our arrival, these 4 children who had been left in the camp daily had disappeared. We found out that during that day, 2 SS men had come into the camp, said they had orders to pick up these children and had taken them away. There was no time for mourning then. Both my mother and I, heartbroken as we both were, we had to line up the morning assembly and go out to work in order to live, to stay alive. If you didn't work, your life was at an end. Post-war, we have been searching for more than 70 years for any scrap of information on my brother's fate, but the day he was taken away, he disappeared off the face of the earth. It's a near certainty that these children did not live beyond that day, because from what I've already told you, you agree with me, the Nazis had no use for any non-productive Jews. Well, we were in this camp for 1 year, and we experienced another selection, very similar to the one I told you, but there was one major difference. As we entered the hall, we were ordered to strip naked, and we had to shuffle forward single file, again, to face a dreaded SS man. As we were shuffling forward, the man immediately behind me in line whispered to me, "If he asks you your age, say you are 17. That's all he said. We weren't allowed to speak, but he took a chance whispering it to me. And as I stood in front of the SS man, that is exactly what he asked me. And as this man, who I sometimes think of as a guardian angel, he had prompted me, and I replied 17, and I was pointed in the direction of those who were allowed to survive this selection. I don't know his fate. He was behind me. I don't know which way he was pointed. My mother was also some way behind me, and she, heartbreakingly, was pointed the other way. For those who would more or less certainly be killed that day. By now, those who were condemned knew their fate, but we had to leave the hall by separate doors, still naked, and assemble outside in two groups, not far apart, but there were guards. Soon after I reached my side, my group, a small number of people from the condemned side began racing across to try and join our group, to mingle among us, to save their lives. Of course, the guards stopped any more running across, and then they began searching, and if they thought they recognized anyone, they would drag them back to the condemned side. And it was then I realized that my mother had been among those who had raced across, and she was still hiding among our group. She was not recognized, and in that manner, with her initiative, she managed to save her life that day. And in fact, she survived and was liberated together with me 9 months later after this selection. We never received our clothing back. This photograph is not personal, just an illustration of the type of clothing we were given instead, a sort of convict uniform. It was thin material, and it meant that in the winter, and these were sort of effectively Russian winters, very, very cold indeed, we suffered not only hunger, but also cold. And there was nothing we could do. That was all we had. These uniforms did not leave our bodies for the rest of our incarceration. We worked in them, we slept in them, they were never washed and never replaced. After 1 year in this camp, a few days after this selection, we were packed into trains, and we arrived again after a horrendous journey during which people died in these wagons. We arrived at our concentration camp of Stutthof. Stutthof was a brutal camp, and we were lucky in being told that our group of 300 was in transit. We were being sent to another labor camp. May I have the next slide, please? This is the entrance gate to Stutthof, and it was known then, and it's known to this day, as Death Gate, because once you entered Stutthof, you were effectively under a death sentence, and very few people left Stutthof alive. We became the envy of the camp, and it became known that we were being sent to another camp. In other words, we left Stutthof alive. We were sent to another labor camp, again close to a junction, and we had to repair bomb-damaged rails again. Time is marching on. I have to condense my talk to meet my allotted time, and I will just tell you of one event which I remember most clearly in this camp. As I said, it was a busy camp. There was a lot of military traffic going through, and sometimes trains stopped and wagons were uncoupled from one train to be coupled to another. Sometimes these trains stood around for hours before they carried on their journey, taking supplies to the war front. And a rumor went around the camp that some of these wagons contained food for the soldiers. One day, driven by extreme hunger, some inmates broke the seal on a wagon, found some food, and of course ate it. In revenge, the Nazis took 8 men hostage, built enormous gallows, and we all had to assemble around this gallows to watch these 8 men being hanged in order to terrorize us into obeying German Nazi orders. After 5 months or so in this camp, again we were packed into cattle wagons, cattle trucks, and sent on a journey for several days under the same inhumane conditions. This time we were packed so tightly that if anyone died, they just couldn't fall down. They were held up by the pressure of people around them. No one could sit down. They were packed like sardines. We arrived, to our horror, back in the camp of Stutthof, but this time not in transit, but as inmates. And we were now facing the same as everyone else. In other words, the end of our lives would probably arrive in Stutthof. If I may please have the next slide. I'm not sure if I can see you, because if something appears to have shifted, I'm no longer seeing the slides, so I'll have to take your word for it. The next slide probably will show you.
We're just on the crematorium slide.
Sorry?
We're just on the crematorium slide.
On which slide?
Crematorium.
I see. Well, I will tell you that when we got back to Stutthof, the camp had really changed. It was no longer a camp where people were being worked to death. You know, that they were exploited by slave labor until they were too weak to work, and then they were killed. But now that the temperament had changed. Until 1943, this camp of Stutthof had neither a gas chamber nor a crematorium, but it was extended very considerably in 1943, and at the same time they built a gas chamber and a crematorium into the camp. And now trainloads of Jews began arriving in Stutthof. Stutthof now had a capacity of up to 25,000 inmates, and by the time we arrived, towards the end of 1944, there were more than 50,000 people, so we had to sleep 2 and sometimes 3 to a single bunk bed. Trainloads of Jews arrived from camps in the east, and lottery-like, I do not understand what logic was behind it. It appeared to be randomly. Some trainloads of Jews were meticulously checked into the camp, which of course meant in practice a sentence of slow death by being starved and weakened until they would die. And some trainloads were taken to the gas chamber and lost their lives on the day they arrived. The picture you can see apparently is of the ovens in the crematorium, which were used to burn the bodies of those who had been gassed. Well, this went on ongoingly. We managed to keep going, but every night people died in their bunk beds. A group of inmates had to walk through the barrack each morning, pick out any bodies that were laid out on the ground outside. A group of Jews had to push a cart around the camp, pick up the bodies and take them to the crematorium. But they were killing Jews at such a rate that the crematorium, working 24 hours a day, couldn't cope with the bodies. So, because they had brought in 2 of those cattle wagons, sealed them and used them as additional gas chambers so they could kill people faster. And as a result, the volume of bodies was such that the crematorium couldn't cope. The excess bodies were just piled up in the open, and every so often they attempted to set them on fire to burn the bodies. It was not uncommon to see people who were just skin and bone, living skeletons. If you could please move on. Just tell me what slide you're showing now.
It's the naked prisoner at the execution camp.
Sorry, it's what?
The naked prisoner at the concentration camp.
Yeah. Well, Stutthof was surrounded, among other things, by a high voltage electric fence. And occasionally one would see one of these people, so as I said, living skeletons, shuffling slowly towards the electric fence to end their suffering. But there were also watchtowers, and often they were instead killed by a shot from the watchtower by one of the guards, because we were not allowed to approach the fence, and when they spotted someone they would shoot. My wife and I, sorry, I said my wife, my mother and I, we were in separate camps in Stuttgart. The ladies' camp, the women's camp, was next to the men's, but separated by a barbed wire. And we couldn't see each other. She didn't know how I fared because we were not working. While we were in this group preparing rails, we were in the same work group and we could see each other. But now, each one really didn't know whether the other was still alive. In this manner, we survived until April 1945, when around 5,000 of us, both men and women, were selected. We were each given a chunk of bread, something like the size of half a loaf of bread. And we were lined up in a long column, and under armed SS guard escort, we were marched out of Stuttgart. We marched for hours, and during this march, I kept trying to walk through the column to see whether I could spot my mother. My mother likewise made her way through the column to see whether I was with this march, and we were overjoyed to find each other. Both of us had been selected by pure chance. All these transfers from camp to camp, we had no input. We had no idea when I was selected whether my mother would be as well, and the other way around. But each time we were sent by chance together. Here we didn't know, and we found each other. We were very happy. We didn't know our fate was going to be, but at least we would share it. So we marched together, and I can tell you these guards were merciless. Anyone who was too weak to keep pace with the column and began trailing was shot, and their bodies just left where they fell. Eventually we reached a small port. We were loaded into 4 very primitive barges, the sort you might use for transporting coal, just open-bodied. We were taken right down into the bottom of the barge, where we had to sit, our legs apart, so the next person could sit between our legs. That's how tightly we were packed. And 4 tugs appeared, manned by SS teams, and they began towing us to sea. And on each of these 6 days, something extraordinarily horrible occurred. I really have to steel myself to tell you about it. The convoy stopped, and as S-man transferred from the tug to the barge, he stood at the top of the barge, where there was a small gangway all the way around the barge. He peered down at us, selected a few men who he said, "You are now under my orders, do exactly what I tell you." He would then at random select one of the people packed downstairs, and this group of men had to grab this person, drag them upstairs onto deck, and then we heard a splash. On his orders, that person was thrown live into the sea to drown. He sent the men down again, selected another victim, and this went on each day. Around 25 at minimum lost their life in this cruel, inhuman manner. I can tell you, I've never wished anything as much as I did then. I guess every one of us had the same wish, to become invisible. Because once he had selected a victim, he insisted that person had to be brought up and drowned in the sea. Each couple of days, the tugs disappeared for a while. We thought to refuel. Incidentally, the SS man told us, "You have to do that. We're using too much fuel towing you." They disappeared, presumably refueled, and then came back and continued towing us. We had no idea what our fate was. On day 6, they went off again, and this time they didn't return. The rumor began going around the boat that they'd gone to get some dynamite. They were going to blow us up to get rid of us. But they just didn't return. We didn't know what had happened. Among our group were a few prisoners of war who were also housed in Stuttgart, as well as Jews, and they were in better physical condition. because I found out later, I didn't know at the time, they had been fed a better diet, probably because of the International Red Cross involvement with prisoners of war. Jews were given a starvation diet, they were given a reasonable diet from which they could exist. They therefore were stronger. A group of them clambered onto the deck. They managed to rip off some planks of wood, and they formed themselves extraordinarily into a rowing team, and they began to attempt to row our barge to the shore. We could see the shore. We were probably roughly half a kilometer from the shore. And extraordinarily, after a while, we didn't know about that, but messages kept coming back. The barge began to turn to face the shore, and so it began inching towards the shore. They rowed for hours, and when they were exhausted, other teams by now were encouraged to take their turn, and the rowing went on all day long, into the night. They rowed through the night until shortly before dawn the barge ran aground. Well, anyone who still had an ounce of strength began clambering onto the deck, jumping into the water and making their way ashore. It was a very dark night. My mother encouraged me to jump, and we waded ashore. It was pitch dark. There was no sign of habitation anywhere. We couldn't see any houses, we couldn't see any lights on. It was just a large expanse of sandy shore. Those of us who had jumped, waded aboard, had no idea which way to run. I remember my mother and I just hunted around for a bit of seaweed to have something to eat, to satisfy our craving stomachs. And while all this was going on, unbelievably, the SS-manned tugs reappeared. Dawn was just breaking, and they, of course, were livid. A group of them made their way onto the barge, and anyone who had not left yet was shot, was murdered. We heard incessant shooting. A second group came ashore and rounded us up. We really thought that our end had come. They would just line us up and shoot us as well. But no, by then daylight was breaking, and they lined us up in a long column, and we were told to march. Time is marching on as well as we need to march, and I have to sort of be brief and unfortunately miss out a few bits I had intended telling you. But what happened is that we were marched into a town where we had to stand to attention for several hours, presumably while our fate was discussed. Then all the guards returned, and we were told to march again. Again, anyone who couldn't keep up to the speed of the march was shot, as before. Many people lost their lives because we were all exhausted. We had been on these barges for 6, this was our day number 7, and apart from that chunk of bread, we had not been given a scrap of food, nor anything to drink for 7 days. So you can imagine our state. We had to march under these guards. Military traffic passed us in both directions, but that was no interest to us, and none of them could help us. Eventually, a tank column came towards us, and as it came closer, suddenly a shout went up from among our group, "Look, our guards, they're running away." And sure, these guards, who moments earlier had still been killing trailing Jews, suddenly turned and ran for their lives. They realized before we did that this was a column of British tanks. And suddenly a shout went up from among us, "We're free, we're free." And so we were. Our guards had run away, disappeared, and of course we were free, but we had no idea what next, what to do. The tanks, incidentally, did not stop. They freed us, they liberated us, and saved our lives purely by chance, traveling along the same route that we were being marched, and the sight of these tanks scared our guards and they ran off. These tanks had orders to their next destination, which they had to capture, and just by passing us, they had liberated us. But while we were pondering on what to do next, truckloads of British soldiers appeared, and they began caring for us. And eventually we were given some food, they allowed us to rest, and then they marched us into a town that had been taken care of. Well, I'll have to really sort of tell you a little bit more shorthand because I don't want to overrun my time. Both my mother and I fell ill. We were in hospital. It was discovered that I had tuberculosis, so I spent a long time in hospital. Eventually I was sent to a convalescent home. My mother was allowed to accompany me because I was still a child in the liberator's eyes. We were interviewed by a British welfare officer whom we gave details of my father, well, just his name, date of birth, and we knew he was somewhere in the UK, but we had no details. My father was permitted to give details of the family he was searching for. It was in pre-computer days, and of course it had to be hunted manually. It took around 3 months before they matched the two statements, and my father was told that part of his family had survived. He was not allowed to come and see us, but he was allowed to write to us and send us parcels. He applied, of course, for permission for us to join him. It took quite a long time, but in September 1946, both my mother and I were permitted to make the journey to the UK. And it was a bittersweet reunion because instead of being a reunion between the four of us, it was just 3 of us. My brother didn't make it. I refused to accept his death for many years. I kept hoping and wishing for a miracle that somehow he had survived. Quite rarely, but one would hear of such a thing happening, that brothers or sisters had found each other after decades after the liberation. Neither knew the other was alive, and I said, well, if it happens there, why not my brother? But eventually I had to accept that he was murdered. And I had to learn English, which I picked up pretty quickly. There's sort of a story I have to condense. My parents, my father was a pauper, I couldn't really afford it, but my mother primarily insisted that one way or another I had to be given the opportunity to catch up on 7 years lost education. They sent me to a private tutorial college. I don't know how they managed to pay for it, but I realized as I matured that they were doing something I couldn't accept, so after a while I refused. I began to take dead-end jobs. Eventually, as I matured, I became a little bit more ambitious, and I wanted to do something more stimulating. And I applied to study at university on advice of friends, but I wouldn't be accepted because I didn't have the qualifications. I spent a couple of years obtaining the qualifications. I could study free of charge, I didn't have to pay. And I applied, was accepted at London University, and I managed to obtain a Bachelor of Science degree in a subject which would be called nowadays electronics. And that's how I began to earn my living. Well, I will just tell you ever so briefly that I have a positive nature, and I began looking forward to a normal life. Eventually, years later, I married a wonderful lady. We had children, we had a wonderful life. We have grandchildren, and they had a normal upbringing. Some survivors never managed to regain a normal life, but I did. And 70 odd years after our liberation, I was contacted by the Holocaust Educational Trust and told that Prince William and his wife, Princess Kate, were visiting Germany and Poland, and they're visiting this concentration camp of Stutthof. They'd expressed a wish to meet a couple of survivors, and I was one of 2 survivors selected. And I had the privilege of meeting the young couple, who incidentally are one of the most charming couples you can imagine. We escorted them around the camp. There's only a skeleton of the camp still around, 80% has been demolished. But nevertheless, that they got a taste. Incredibly, both the gas chamber and the crematorium survived unscathed. It was an incredible experience. Both the royal couple and us 2 survivors actually went into the crematorium, and the ovens are there ready to work again. The Germans attempted to demolish the evidence, but in this case they were unsuccessful. And despite these things being there, large as life, there are hundreds of thousands of people who have been indoctrinated into saying it's all a Jewish lie, it never happened. Anyone can walk into Stutthof. It's been turned into sort of a walk-through exhibition. You're free to go into the crematorium and see, and yet there are denials. I didn't dream that that would ever happen in my lifetime while there were still witnesses around. But thank God I've lived a fulfilling life. I still blessed this country for having given me the chance to settle here and live a productive life. I have had nothing but kindness during my life here. And I can tell you, when I arrived as an ignorant youngster in 1946, I didn't dream that I would ever see royalty, never mind shake their hands, or be connected to royalty. And it confirms what I have always felt of this country, that the British are uniquely tolerant and kind people. I, probably thankful as I am not sufficiently thankful for the privilege which has been my life here. I didn't dream that I would ever experience in my lifetime such a swell of anti-Semitism as we're experiencing now. I didn't dream that I would experience the horrific events in Darfur, in Serbia, in Sudan. It was just not on the agenda. When I came here, every politician was saying loud and clear, never again, never again. But I'm afraid that 75, 80 years is a long time, and here we are where we are. One way or another, these social websites have to be brought under some sort of control. Otherwise, I think all our future, not only the Jewish future, but the future of our Western culture and freedom here in this country, I think would eventually be at risk, unless this stream of poison which emanates from these social websites is stopped. I'm afraid I have to stop here. I've not been as detailed as I would have liked to be, but I understand we're all working to a time schedule, and I thank you for the privilege of permitting me to try and educate you into some understanding of what actually transpired during the Holocaust. I know 6 million is an abstract figure which is very difficult to become meaningful. On my slide there is one photograph of a heap of shoes. I didn't have time to ask for it, but if you put it on now, you can glance at these and just imagine that each pair of these shoes represents a human being who lost their life in the gas chambers. Before people entered the gas chamber, they were told to take off their shoes, and that heap of shoes is what accumulated in Stutthof. Just try and understand 2 shoes equal 1 Jew who lost their lives by being gassed. Thank you. I will now finish and allow you to continue the program. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now hand to the Right Reverend Martin Gorrick, Bishop of Dudley.
Sorry, were you speaking to me?
Alia, do you have me speaking now?
Yes, all live and ready to go.
That's good. That's good. I couldn't see it on the screen. But friends, thank you for coming today. And from the bottom of my heart and on behalf of all the people of Dudley, I would like to thank Manfred for joining us today. I've heard and read and learnt so much about the Shoah, the Holocaust, as it's known, but never had the privilege of meeting a survivor of those terrible, terrible events. Manfred, thank you. You were given a number, I think it was 46578, but you'll remember it forever. You were given a number, but unlike your captors, you never lost your humanity. And your humanity as a child of God shone forth today in your 90th year. You are still such a witness of true humanity, true kindness, true determination and compassion. And I hope that through your words, you've made all of us witnesses for the future. The number murdered, 6 million, is so familiar, but the reality is mind-blowing. I have a book here, and it takes me just a few seconds to flick through several hundred pages. Now imagine on every page is the face of a person killed in the Holocaust. It would take me over 41 hours or 2 days and 2 nights at this speed to glimpse the face of every person murdered in the Shoah. Or on 9/11, 3,000 people lost their lives in New York in the most deadly terrorist attack America has ever known. In the Holocaust, an average of 3,000 Jewish people lost their lives every day for 5 whole years. It's unimaginable. Hitler's regime collapsed under the weight of its own wickedness. As Martin Luther King said, no lie can live forever. But as Manfred has said so clearly, people still spread lies today on social media and elsewhere. We need to speak and seek the truth. People still seek to spread hatred of others different from themselves. We need to resist them. As Manfred said, Hitler saw people's indifference to Jewish suffering in those early years of the 1930s as a green light for his destruction. We have to challenge prejudice and racism, even challenge our own government at times, to resist prejudice and to welcome refugees and others as they did when this government welcomed Manfred in 1946. When we face the challenges of our age, COVID, climate change, poverty, racial injustice, we can only do this together as one. In a moment, we will hear from the Lord Lieutenant John Crabtree, the Queen's representative in the West Midlands, and he will conclude our commemoration today. But first, we come before God in prayer. The God of compassion who lies within and beyond us all. I would like to invite our most honoured guest, Manfred Goldberg, to lead our special prayer of memorial.
You are now live, Manfred. If you could just unmute, that would be great. Just need to unmute your microphone, Manfred. I'm just having some technical difficulties, guys. Please do bear with us. Bishop, we might need you just to pick this one up if that's okay.
That's fine. Manfred is still looking. Just give him one moment to try to unmute. I know it's very difficult. If you move your mouse or put your finger on the little pad, sometimes it pops up and you can see a microphone symbol with a line through it. If you click on that, it puts you back on. Otherwise, I can step in. Forgive me, Manfred, but I will step in unless I hear you speaking in a moment. And I'll read the prayer that he was due to read for us. So let's just spend a moment in quiet as we give thanks for Manfred, for his mother and father, and for the brother he loved and lost. The brother who was one of so many million, so tragically murdered. We cherish the memory of those who died as martyrs, those who died resisting and those who died in terror. We mourn for all that died with them, their goodness and their wisdom, which could have done so much to ennoble and enrich humanity. We mourn for the genius and the wit that died, the learning and the laughter that were lost. We salute those who had the courage to stand outside the mob, to save us and to suffer with us. They too are God's witnesses and a source of hope when we are tempted to despair. We stand in gratitude for the simple, decent lives of those who were the congregation of Israel and all who were murdered in the Shoah, the Holocaust, and other genocides. Their spiritual resistance remains as an enduring testimony that light persisted in darkness. Each person was unique, and we remember them all in love and compassion. Because of all who have suffered, and may such times never come again, and may their sacrifice not be in vain. In our daily fight against cruelty and prejudice, tyranny and persecution, their memory gives us strength. God of compassion, shelter them forever under your wings, and let their souls be bound up in the bond of eternal life. May they rest in peace. Amen.
Amen.
Now I'd like to invite our Lord Lieutenant, John Crabtree, Queen's representative in the West Midlands, to conclude the event.
I have managed to unmute myself.
Bless you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This is always such an important event in our annual calendar. It's always a privilege to be here in Dudley, although I'm doing that virtually today. And it's an event that demands a pause for thought. I have been so fortunate in my very safe and very privileged life to hold many roles. I could be described as an old lawyer because I spent half my life practicing law. And during those legal years, if there was one skill of any practical use that I focused on all the time, it was to try and step into my client's shoes, as I called it, to listen, to understand my client's issues, and therefore to provide advice that was relevant and appropriate to them. But despite all that experience and all that learning, despite a real deep interest in history, despite having the privilege of meeting many now Holocaust survivors, and indeed visiting Auschwitz-Birkenau myself, being able to gain any understanding of the experience of the Holocaust, or being able in any way at all to step into Manfred's shoes, as we've heard today, has of course and will always be completely beyond me. And I know I speak for everyone on this call in saying that. But to echo Bishop Martin, what we can do is insist that we continue to learn, and above all, we continue to remember. I often reflect when I think this on a considerably wiser and a much older lawyer, Cicero, 2,000 years ago, who said to be ignorant of what occurred before you were born is to remain always a child. And there can be no greater lesson from the warnings of history than the Holocaust. But too often we have to ask ourselves whether it is a lesson we have learned. Tragically, we will witness distressing examples of xenophobia and racism almost daily. Of course, the appalling events of May the 25th in Minneapolis immediately come to mind, but we are reminded regularly that anti-Semitic and other incidents of discrimination continue to grow, with increasing fractures within our society and within societies around the globe. So there is such a responsibility on all of us. Today's expression, as students on the call and my children would say, to call out, not just to tolerate, not just to be passive, but to speak up. It is our job in everything we do to celebrate and to applaud difference, that we recognise the real risks of divergence in our community today, divergence, not convergence, and therefore we commit ourselves relentlessly to assist in every way possible in knitting our communities together. While still with lawyers, we lost Ruth Bader Ginsburg last autumn, the Supreme Court Justice who was deeply committed to her Jewish identity, and the very first woman in the history of the United States to lie in state in the US Capitol. Often when I'm thinking of divergence, I remember her words, her reflection, when she said, "Dissent sees flames where in truth there is no fire." The theme, as we've heard for Holocaust Memorial Day this year, is be light in the darkness. From the early days of the pandemic, we have seen quite wonderful examples of communities working across all boundaries, across geography, faith, heritage, class, gender, age, to bring help and support to the vulnerable. Examples which, through the privilege of my role, I have been able to witness firsthand and hear about almost daily. Heartwarming, and if I'm honest, at times well beyond a dry eye. So, ladies and gentlemen, we must pause today to reflect on the past. We must resolve to learn the lessons of the past, and we must resolve to commit ourselves in the present and into the future to search for the light. On behalf of all of us, my sincere thanks to Lord Ian, to Lord Austin, to all the Dudley College team who brought us together today, to all of you who've joined in and devoted time during your busy lives to participate. A special word for Helen and James, who read so eloquently, to Bishop Martin, and of course in particular to you, Manfred. It has been such a privilege to share this event, this virtual event with you. Next year, all being well, we will be back in College Hall in Dudley, and we will all look forward to that. Thank you.